Here in South Australia, we are growing crops in one of the lowest rainfall environments and on some of the most fragile soils in the world. The drought conditions of the 2018 growing season, depicted here in this image, have been a harsh reminder of just how fragile this environment is. So can we grow healthy crops in sandy soils? Our ability to produce productive and sustainable crops in these soils is as important as it has ever been. Sandy soils are an important production system in Australia. They make up more than 20% of Australia's arable land. Here in the southern cropping region, we have more than 5 million hectares of sandy soils, with a further 5 million hectares of sandy soils for cropping in Western Australia. They are also globally relevant, with more than 400 million hectares of sands in the world. So you might ask, why don't we just move our crops to the more fertile land, leave our fragile landscapes alone? But we know that we have an ever-increasing global population, and we need to feed these people. And in fact, the amount of arable land that we have available to us is diminishing across all soil types due to a range of land degradation options. So walking away from these sands is really not an option. The great dust storms of the 1980s really instigated some important changes in the way we manage our soils in Australia. This really brought about the adoption of conservation agriculture. The key principles of conservation agriculture are the removal of tillage, which is the physical disruption of the soil, the retention of stubble or residue to maintain cover, and the increased growth of legumes in the crop rotation. So legumes are crops like field peas and lupins and lentils, and we're growing them in rotation with cereals such as wheat and barley. In the southern region, to understand sandy soils, we need to understand the mallee landscape. The term mallee refers to the native vegetation. The mallee tree has a shallow root due to the poor soils, and above the ground it's highly branched with a cup shape so that it stays stable despite its shallow roots. The mallee landscape is dominated by dune swale systems. The dune is a deep sand in the highest part of the landscape, and we move down the slope into heavier soils that contain less and less sand through to the flat or the swale, which tends to be a clay loam. So what we have here is soil types changing over relatively short distances. But as you can see from the image, often I think we depict sand dunes as being very high and very sharp, but in fact what we have is rapid changes in soil type, but only relatively small changes in elevation. It can be as small as 10 to 15 metres. Just zooming in a bit on the key soil types in these environments, the dune soil is the deep sand. It's the soil that has the lowest amount of organic matter, it has the least fertility, which means it has trouble supplying nutrients to crops. It also can be water repellent, so the soil particles can coat with wax that prevents water from getting into the soil and being stored. With this property, it's quite loose on the surface, that makes it prone to erosion, yet it has the unique ability to compact at depth as well, preventing root penetration. It really is the problem child of our soils. As we move down the slope, we have our mid-slope soils. These are still sandy in the surface, so they're low in organic matter and fertility, but underlying that is a clay. And the clay means that that soil can hold water. And this, because it can hold water, it makes this soil more reliable over most of the season types that we have in this environment. At the base of the slope, we have our clay loam soils. These are the heaviest soils. They are the most fertile, and in wetter seasons, they can be the most productive soils. But an issue with these soils is that because they have the clay, when it's very dry, they tend to hang on to that water, making it difficult for crops to get hold of it. And so if you drive around in low rainfall environments in a season like this, you'll see that in the flats, those crops are turning off very early compared to the rest of the landscape. Since 2009, we've been working on a strategy to improve the nutrition of crops on sandy soils. The strategy we've been exploring is called soil-specific management, and we've been looking at wheat and canola. We've really focused on nitrogen fertiliser because that's the key nutrient that we need to get right for crop productivity before we address the others. So when we started this work, farmers were applying 15 kilos of nitrogen per hectare across all of the soil types. And what we did was explore changing the rate of fertiliser according to the soil type. And what we found was in the heavier soil types, if we moved away from that 15 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, there was actually no change. But if we increased the inputs on the sandy soil types, so in the mid-slopes, we increased wheat grain yield by 15%. And in our problem child soil, we actually increased grain yield by 60%. So the way that farmers are adopting this work is to increase their inputs of fertiliser on their sandy soils and maintain or reduce their fertiliser inputs on the swales. Another way that we can bring more nitrogen into the system is the inclusion of legumes, because they are able to fix nitrogen. To fix nitrogen, they need to be productive, so that's one area of our work, to make sure that we have strategies to make the legumes themselves productive. But we also want to understand how productive legumes influence the rest of the cropping system. And then we can change how we rotate our crops to get the maximum benefit. And so what we've found is that by increasing the amount of legumes in our rotation, we can get 1 tonne per hectare cereal grain yield benefits after these legumes. And this in part has contributed to a 4 times increase in the amount of legumes grown in the low rainfall environment since 2006. And now we have 28% of our cropland under legumes. For our water repellent sands, one of the strategies that we've been trying is something called on-row or edge-row sowing. And what that means is that we're sowing as close as practical to the previous crop row. And the reason we do that is because the previous crop row creates a little microenvironment. And with that residue there, we're able to funnel more water into the soil and store more water. In fact, we've found 3 times more water in the surface at that position close to the previous crop row. With this extra water, we're able to establish more crop plants. So we've got 60% more crop plants with this extra water. And the spin-off benefit of this is that we're able to produce a crop that's more competitive with weeds. So because the weeds are also trying to emerge in this position near the previous crop row, and we've got more plants, more crop plants, we've provided competition and we've reduced brome grass seed set by 3 times. I've talked a lot about strategies that reduce the amount of tillage in the system. And now I'm talking about strategies that are actually very heavy interventions. And the reason I'm talking about these strategies is that we're looking for ways to completely modify the profiles of our problem sands. And the reason we're doing this is we want to tackle those issues of compaction and poor fertility. The idea is that we use these more extreme interventions, but we don't use them very often, and we make substantial lifts in productivity. Some examples of the things that we're exploring are an intervention called spading, which is a bit like using a rotary hoe in the paddock. And the reason we do that is it mixes the top 30 centimetres of soil. So that mixes the organic matter through a bigger layer, and it also breaks up compaction in that top 30 centimetres. The other strategy that we're exploring is deep ripping. Deep ripping is a strategy using a straight tine down to 70 centimetres to try and get all of the key compacted layer, and we're fracturing that layer, breaking it up, allowing roots to penetrate. And I'll give you an example here of our new ripping equipment entering into one of our plots. And you'll see that behind the tine there's a clear plastic tube. So alongside these physical strategies, we're also adding extra inputs to boost the fertility. So we're trying things like manures and composts and fertilisers to boost the fertility, along with fracturing up that compacted layer. So I hope that I've been able to show you today that through our research collaborations, we have been working with growers to increase the productivity and sustainability of sandy soils. And when we see these images of dust-blown landscapes in drought conditions, you understand that there's a huge plethora of people working as hard as they can to make these environments more sustainable, and hopefully we will see these images less and less.